I'm not convinced that any elected official is even interested in reducing the market price of homes or even the cost of rent.
Our job is to handle the biggest crisis of our time, which is housing. It's created by this federal Liberal government, but we could put that behind us and instead come to the table and have a meaningful work to be able to create more doors for Albertans and Canadians. And right now, from what I see from this Prime Minister and his government, they have no intention of working with Alberta in a meaningful way.
From Ottawa's corridors of power to the sprawling landscapes of Canada's real estate market, a troubling reality is beginning to take shape. Housing prices, known as a hot-button topic, capturing the attention of policymakers, economists, and everyday Canadians alike, are soaring to stratospheric heights. Amid soaring prices and mounting affordability concerns, one might assume that politicians would be eager to implement measures to bring housing costs down. However, a closer look reveals a more ironic reality. As the cost of housing continues to skyrocket and the dream of home ownership slips further out of reach for countless Canadians, a growing number of citizens are starting to ask a simple but profound question. Why do political leaders seem so unwilling to take meaningful action to address this crisis? To provide further context, let's look at the ridiculous costs that the average Canadian has to dish out on housing. The Canadian Real Estate Association reported earlier last year that the average cost of a home in Canada is $716,000. Despite this spiraling cost, it is also of genuine concern that thousands of Canadian politicians at all levels are in potential conflict of interest on housing prices because they belong to the landlord class. 41% of cabinet ministers hold real estate assets for profit-generating purposes, an increase from the previous cabinet's 31% or 12 out of 39 ministers. Members of Parliament must disclose such assets to the Federal Conflict of Interest Commissioner. In 2022, 62 Liberal MPs received money from investment properties in some form or other, as did 54 Conservative MPs, including leader Pierre Poilievre, 6 Bloc Quebecy MPs, and 4 NDP MPs. In essence, at least 20% of Canadian MPs hold rental, investment real estate properties, vacant land, recreational properties, or income from or significant interests in real estate brokerages. Ironically, despite years of rhetoric and half-hearted policy measures by the Canadian government, the problem of skyrocketing housing costs has only continued to worsen, leaving millions of Canadians struggling to keep a roof over their heads. In this video, we delve into the intriguing question of why Canadian politicians seem reluctant to see housing prices decline, and explore the factors driving their stance on this critical issue. Housing in Canada has become a major political issue as prices continue to rise astronomically. As this trend continues, a disturbing pattern is also beginning to emerge, one that suggests that the reluctance of the country's political class to tackle the housing crisis may be rooted in something far more insidious than mere incompetence or indifference. The reality of the situation is far more disturbing. Many of Canada's most powerful politicians are deeply invested in the system that is driving up housing costs and pricing out ordinary Canadians. They are landlords, real estate investors, and property developers with vast portfolios of rental properties and development projects that stand to lose value if housing prices were to suddenly drop. This conflict of interest is not mere speculation or conjecture, but a matter of public record. A recent investigation found that at least 20% of sitting members of Parliament own rental properties, with some owning dozens or even hundreds of units. This includes high-profile figures like Conservative MP Pierre Poilievre and his wife, who owns a staggering amount of rental properties in Ottawa alone. But the problem goes far beyond individual politicians. In fact, it is woven into the very fabric of the nation's political system, where the influence of the real estate industry is felt at every level of government. The first and perhaps most obvious of these incentives is the sheer size and importance of the housing market to the Canadian economy as a whole. According to reports, Canada lost some ground when it came to lowering its dependence on housing. Residential investment rose 0.1 points to 7.8% of GDP in Q3 of 2023, making it one of the economy's largest and most important sectors. This means that any significant downturn in the housing market could have devastating ripple effects across the entire country, leading to job losses, reduced consumer spending, and a general slowdown in economic growth. For politicians who are always looking to tout their economic track record and secure re-election, this is a risk that many are simply unwilling to take. After all, a booming housing market is often seen as a sign of a strong and growing economy, even if the reality is far more complex and troubling. However, the importance of housing to the economy goes even deeper than this. For politicians who rely on this robust industry's support and often receive significant campaign contributions from developers and real estate firms, this is a risk that many are unwilling to take. This fear is not entirely unfounded. In the past, politicians who have taken steps to address housing affordability have sometimes faced backlash from the real estate industry and its allies. In British Columbia, for example, the provincial government's decision to introduce a foreign buyer's tax in 2016 was met with fierce opposition from the real estate industry, which argued that the tax would harm the economy and lead to job losses. Even more troubling is how the housing market can distort political priorities and lead to a focus on short-term gain over long-term sustainability. In a market where prices are constantly rising, politicians can be tempted to prioritize policies that will keep the good times rolling, even if those policies are ultimately unsustainable or harmful in the long run. One need only look at the staggering sums of money that flow from real estate developers and investors into the coffers of political parties and campaigns to see the extent of this influence. In the 2018 Ontario provincial election, for example, the real estate industry donated hundreds of thousands to the campaign of Premier Doug Ford and his Progressive Conservative Party, more than any other industry group. This flood of cash buys more than just access and influence. It buys a seat at the table when it comes to shaping the very policies that determine the future of housing in Canada. And all too often, that seat is used to push for policies that prioritize the interests of developers and investors over those of ordinary Canadians. We see this dynamic play out in the way Trudeau's Liberal governments have consistently failed to take meaningful action to address the root causes of the housing crisis. From the federal government's refusal to crack down on money laundering and tax evasion in the real estate market, to the provincial government's gutting of rent control and tenant protections, to the municipal government's zoning and permitting processes that prioritize luxury condos over affordable housing, the fingerprints of the real estate lobby are everywhere. Another egregious example of this conflict of interest can be found in the way that politicians have consistently offloaded the responsibility for addressing the housing crisis onto the shoulders of the Bank of Canada, a supposedly independent institution that it is, in reality, deeply intertwined with the interests of the financial elite. For years, successive governments have relied on the Bank of Canada to keep interest rates low and the housing market humming, even as the cost of housing has soared out of reach for millions of Canadians. And while the bank has occasionally paid lip service to the need for a soft landing in the housing market, its actions have consistently prioritized the interests of investors and speculators over those of ordinary Canadians. This is not by accident. The Bank of Canada is, after all, an institution that is deeply embedded in the very system that has created the housing crisis in the first place. Its governors and board members are drawn from the ranks of the financial elite with deep ties to the real estate industry and the big banks that finance it, and its mandate, as set out by the federal government, prioritizes inflation control and economic stability over the urgent need for affordable housing. In this context, it is perhaps unsurprising that the bank has been so reluctant to take meaningful action to cool the housing market. To do so would be to risk destabilizing the very system that has made so many of its key stakeholders and allies incredibly wealthy. However, while the Bank of Canada may be the most visible manifestation of this conflict of interest, it is far from the only one. In fact, the entire government apparatus, from the bureaucracy to the courts to the regulatory bodies that oversee the housing market, is shot through with individuals and institutions with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Take, for example, the case of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, or CMHC, the federal agency responsible for overseeing the country's housing market. In theory, the CMHC is supposed to be a neutral arbiter, ensuring that all Canadians have access to safe, affordable housing. In practice, however, the agency has consistently prioritized the interests of the real estate industry over those of ordinary Canadians. This can be seen in how the CMHC has consistently downplayed the risks of an overheated housing market, even as warning signs have mounted in recent years. It can be seen in the way that the agency has resisted calls for tougher lending standards and more stringent regulations on the real estate industry, arguing that such measures could hurt the economy. It can also be seen in how the agency has funneled millions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies and guarantees to the developers and investors who are driving up housing costs in the first place. Developers like prices to go up during the several years it takes to build new homes. If prices or rents go down during the risk-filled construction process, their profit margins can be shot. Developers and affluent homeowners are the biggest donors to political parties. The BC Liberals hauled in millions from developers, including those based offshore. Rising Rising home prices have fueled Canada's economic growth. It has allowed Canadians to borrow against their own homes to spend and invest in more real estate. It's also led to Canada's housing industry, especially in BC and Ontario, making up much more of the economy than in most nations. The truth is, just like the Canadian government, the governments will never want home prices to fall. While it may make housing more affordable, it can mean thousands of families may end up losing their homes. It could create an economic meltdown if too many people default on their mortgages and their houses get dumped on the market. The banking system could then be impacted as it was in the U.S. during the 2008 recession. As the debate over housing affordability rages on, it's evident that the interests of developers, investors, and affluent homeowners often align with those of politicians, who rely on their financial support to fund their campaigns and maintain power. The symbiotic relationship between the real estate industry and the political establishment creates a significant barrier to meaningful reform and regulation in the housing market. Furthermore, the interconnectedness of the housing market with the broader economy makes policymakers hesitant to implement measures that could lead to a decline in housing prices. Rising home prices have become intertwined with economic growth, driving consumer spending, investment, and job creation. Any significant downturn in the housing market could have far-reaching consequences for the economy as a whole, potentially leading to a recession or financial crisis. Moreover, the political fallout from a housing market downturn could be severe for elected officials. Homeownership is a cornerstone of the Canadian dream, and any policies perceived as threatening that dream could be met with public backlash and electoral consequences. As a result, politicians may be inclined to prioritize short-term economic stability and their own political survival over the long-term interests of Canadians struggling with housing affordability. In this callous climate, the voices of ordinary Canadians, particularly millennials and marginalized communities, often go unheard amidst the cacophony of special interests and political calculations. Despite the urgency of this crisis, it's evident the Canadian government is too beholden to the interests of the real estate industry, too afraid of the political risks of taking on the status quo, and too focused on short-term gains to make the kind of long-term investments that are needed to build a more sustainable and equitable housing system. Ultimately, addressing the root causes of Canada's housing crisis will require bold leadership, political courage, and a willingness to challenge entrenched interests. It will require policymakers to prioritize the needs of the many over the profits of the few, and to implement comprehensive reforms that ensure housing is a basic human right, not a commodity to be bought and sold for dubious personal profit. If you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications on our latest news and analysis. In the meantime, check out one of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.